hey, you'd be rich if you didn't buy so many freaking lattes. That's one of those pieces of advice that you just kind of assume like emerged spontaneously and organically, like mold on a shower curtain. But actually, the Latte Factor has an originator. Bach. Not that Bach, this Bach. And in 2019, David Bach wrote an entire book about it. How does one write an entire book about not buying lattes, you ask? The answer is weird. This book could have been a tweet, but instead, David Bach gave us 121 pages of some decent advice, a lot of misleading math, and a money philosophy that has an absolutely glaring blind spot. So let's talk about it. I'm Ben with the YNAB team, and this is Sketchy Advice. This cost me $5, which means I will now never be a millionaire, so I think the least you could do is subscribe. Reading this book was bizarre because I opened it to the first chapter and I started reading about Zoey, who is on the train in New York City. She's got a latte and she can't stop thinking about
the photograph.
I've not been told what the photograph is. She sees a billboard that talks about like, where are you going in life? And she's thinking about that. She takes a walk through the 9/11 memorial. And I'm thinking,
man,
this is a detailed, heavy-handed anecdote to start your book with. And then I turn to chapter 2 and it keeps going. And as I read, it slowly starts to dawn on me that this is the book. This isn't some boring nonfiction personal finance book. This is a novella. This is a personal finance fable. Which honestly, kudos to David Bach and John David Mann, who I assume did most of the actual writing and storytelling in this book, for trying something different. Having a story did give it a little more oomph. It did make me a little more invested and curious about what was going to happen. But I've got to say, this was one of the most on-the-nose books that I've ever read. This book is about achieving financial freedom, and Zoey works in the Freedom Tower. At one point, she meets an oil baron named Oil. Just kidding. His name is Baron. And it's full of little tidbits like this. And talk about irony, here she was, 27 years old, an associate editor for a world-famous travel magazine, and she'd never been outside the US. A travel editor who never traveled. Man, I'm glad they told me that was ironic, or just... Now, to be fair, I'm not expecting The Great Gatsby. I don't expect these characters to have deep psychological nuance, because they're just there to spout certain talking points. But reading this book does feel a bit like your teacher rolling out the TV cart in 8th grade health. That being said, not once does David Bach endorse child wage slavery. So, it is beating Rich Dad Poor Dad. Our main character in this story is Zoey. She's cast as kind of a typical millennial. She's a young professional. She lives in a high cost of living city. She's got student loans. She's using credit cards to make ends meet, and she hates keeping a budget. Zoey thought she would qualify as poster child for the phrase living paycheck to paycheck. Zoey, you literally are a poster child. You are a didactic plot device for teaching that concept. So Zoey, the paycheck to paycheck poster child, is feeling kind of existential today because she just got offered a job that would be a lot more stressful, but be a lot more high paying. And it came through her friend who sends her texts with emoticons with little noses. Red flag. And for some reason, she can't get her mind off of this photograph she saw at her favorite coffee shop. The actual photo doesn't really matter. What does matter is she wants to buy it, but it's
$1,200.
Which prompts some Rich Dad Poor Dad style slam poetry. I can't afford it. In the song that was Zoey's life, that was the chorus. The verses might be inspiring, adventurous, or contemplative. I'd love to go back to school, tour the American Southwest, travel Europe, have a place with an actual bedroom where I could write and do some yoga, but they always came back around to the same refrain. But I can't afford it. She's talking about this with her cool boss, Barbara, and Barbara recommends she go talk to Henry, who works at the coffee shop. Because Henry sees things... he sees things differently. Henry is a 70-year-old man who, throughout this book, is presented as like an Obi-Wan mystical mentor with these like cryptic, crazy ideas. And it's this big mystery of like, how does this barista know so much about money? He's not a barista. He owns the coffee shop. I know that's probably obvious, but that's like a twist in the book. And truth be told, Henry mostly just gives like a grandfatherly version of some of the most basic personal finance advice you'll see on YouTube. The first piece of wisdom that Henry drops on Zoey is that if she can afford that $3 latte, she can afford that $1,200 photo. And you can probably guess what he means by that, but Zoey is flabbergasted. She spends the next 70 pages being like, but what did he mean? And then Henry jumps into his 3 steps to financial freedom. Step 1 is an oldie, but a goodie. Say it with me. Pay yourself first! And to be honest, I actually like this part. Henry walks Zoey through her workday and asks her to think about who or what gets her money for each hour of work. The first 3 hours go to taxes, the next 2 go to rent, the next goes to transportation, and the final 2 hours are where kind of everything else falls. Henry's advice is to pay yourself the first hour of every workday, which is honestly a pretty clever way to frame saving a little over 10% of your income. And then we get charty. Henry tells her that if she paid herself $5 a day, every day, at a 10% annual return.
I know, I'm gonna talk about it, just calm down.
Then after 1 year, she'd have $1,885. After 10 years, she'd have over $30,000. And after 40 years, she'd have $948,000. Bump that up to $10 a day, and after 40 years, he says she'll have $1.9 million. And then we get one of my favorite exchanges in the whole book. Zoey's eyes widened as she scanned down the last few rows of numbers and saw the total at the bottom. Whoa, she said. How did you do that? Henry chuckled. I didn't do it, Zoey. Mother Nature did it. That's the way nature works. It's how bacteria multiply, how rumors spread, how wealth is built. Some say it's the most powerful force in the universe. The miracle of compound interest. I get what he's talking about. I understand, but it is so funny to talk about stock market returns as a product of Mother Nature when the stock market is one of the most made up things ever. You buy imaginary pieces of a company at a value that's determined by who knows. And that value goes up or down based on the economy or trolls on Reddit or people's feelings about what the value should be. Henry just watches the ticker tape on CNBC and he's just nature's amazing. So weird. He refers to all of this as Zoey's Latte Factor. And once again, she is just she has no idea what he could possibly mean. Then we hit chapter 5, Doubts. David Bach has had a lot of critics and skeptics of his philosophy. Helene Olin wrote a book called Pound Foolish in 2016 that had a pretty substantial critique of him. A lot of personal finance bloggers took issue with his latte math. So it's 2019 and David needs to acknowledge some of these critiques. And he does that through a character named Jeffrey. Jeffrey is a social media app developer who's always trying to get in on the next Instagram. And here's how he's described. Jeffrey was a nice enough guy and she liked him. But she found she could only take so much of his cynical outlook. He had what seemed to Zoey a knee-jerk hostile reaction to rich people, no matter who they were, and was especially suspicious of large, successful corporations, like the one where she worked, for instance. Although she had to wonder, if one of his apps struck market gold, wouldn't he become one of those big, successful corporations? You really get the vibe that Jeffrey is kind of insufferable, which feels just a little petty. David, your critics said your math was wrong and your economic analysis was reductive. That's not anti-rich or cynical. That's just feedback. So Zoey shares Henry's chart with Jeffrey, and he has 3 objections. Zoey, give me a break. 10%? How? Where are you gonna earn 10%? Besides, the whole system is rigged, Zoe. You know that. The more you try to save, the more oh, that voice is hard. The more you try to save, the more the government takes. And then there's inflation. You know how much $1 million will be worth in 40 years? You'll be lucky to afford a slot in an old folks' home. Feels kind of needlessly rude. 10% returns don't exist. Taxes will eat up your wealth, and inflation will eat up your wealth. All points made by David's critics. So Zoey brings these objections to Henry, but before he addresses them, he reveals his second secret to financial freedom. He paused slightly for dramatic effect, then said, I imagine you've been taught about the virtue of budgets. Oh boy, thought Zoey, here we go. Zoey hated budgets. She knew it wasn't rational, but something in her rebelled at the very idea of it. Budgets? Trumpeted Baron. Oh, this is the oil baron. He's from Oklahoma. Ha! First thing you do with a budget is you take the whole idea, virtue and all, and toss it in the trash with the rest of the garbage. You hate budgets, am I right? Of course you do. Everyone does. We hate the things. Hate them like poison. Is this a problematic accent? Am I going to get canceled in Oklahoma for this? Zoey was looking forward to seeing how Henry was going to handle that outburst and still remain his ever-polite barista self. Henry just nodded. He's right, of course. Zoey stared at him. Excuse me? Oh, budgets work well enough for corporations and other organizations, but not so well for individuals. If you have to write a check every week to make your saving plan work, it just won't happen. Who writes a check? What part of budgeting involves writing a check? I don't know. It's not a measure of character, Zoey. It's human nature. The idea of a personal budget sounds sensible in theory, but in the real world, it doesn't work. Know why that is? Put in Baron. Zoey cleared her throat and said, no. Why? 'Cause they're no fun, that's why. So this is all leading up to his second secret, which is don't budget, make it automatic. And then he goes on to talk about how you should set up your 401k to pull money out of your paycheck before you get it, which is, of course, sensible advice. It's much easier to save when you don't see that money you're saving as part of your available income. But weirdly, for a whole section that's about how budgeting doesn't work, he doesn't give a single piece of advice on how to manage the money that is still in your paycheck. That money just kind of works itself out, I guess. We'll talk about that more later, because now Henry is going to start addressing Jeffrey's objections. So first, the idea that taxes will eat all your wealth. Yes, your 401k gets taxed when you withdraw from it, but because you're tax deferred when you put money into it, you have more money that's able to grow for longer, which means more riches in the long term. Which, yeah, fair, decent advice. But then he tackles the 10% objection, and this is where things get sketchy. Henry's rebuttal is that if you look at the stock market over the last 80 years, it's averaged at least 10% return. So you can reliably count on getting about a 10% return in the stock market. So let's just take that fact on its face. The average annual return of the stock market over the last 80 years has been 10%. Let's just assume that's true. Henry acknowledges that the stock market doesn't always give 10%, sometimes it even dips, but the average is 10%, so that's what you can count on. Those dips don't really matter. But they do. They really do. Let's say I make a one-time investment of $100 into something and I let it sit for 3 years. And let's say I get a consistent 10% return every single year. So the first year, my $100 goes up to 110. The second year, it goes up to 121. And the next year, it goes up to $133.10. Now let's do the same thing. But let's say that the first year, my money goes up 10%. The second year, it dips 20%. And then the third year, it skyrockets 40%. Balanced out, that's still an average return of 10% over 3 years. But let's actually look at those numbers. The first year, I'll have $110, just like before. Then I lose 20% of that, giving me $88. Then I gain 40% of that, landing me at $123.60. The average return is exactly the same. But in that second scenario, I wind up with nearly $10 less because of that dip. You get those spectacular numbers in Henry's math because it's assuming you're getting 10% year after year after year with no dips. And when you say, but what about the dips? He says, well, you have times where you get a lot more gain and those cancel out the dips. But they don't. The dips make a difference. And listen, the idea that if you have a lot of time for your investments to grow, you should just let them sit. Don't try to time it. Just ride out the dips and all that. I'm all for that. That's what I personally do with my own investments. But you have to acknowledge that there are a variety of possible outcomes. You're much better off running your investment strategy through a Monte Carlo simulation where you can see a range of outcomes based on hundreds of possible dips and spikes that could happen. Henry is presenting a kind of best case scenario as if it's the norm, and that feels just misleading to me. And remember Jeffrey's third objection about how inflation would eat into your returns? You know what Henry has to say about that? Nothing. I don't know what happened here. Jeffrey brings up the objection and then David Bach just goldfishes and never addresses it anywhere in the book. Which is a pretty big deal because the way you actually experience wealth is through how much buying power you have. In an earlier book, David Bach said that $3.50 saved every day at a 10% annual return would net someone $1.2 million after 40 years. One of his critics ran those numbers factoring in inflation and concluded that that would equal about $231,000 of buying power. Which is still cool, by the way. The fact that a contribution that small could give you that much buying power, that's still worth thinking about. But it's less than a quarter of what David Bach is promising. But David Bach doubles down on this. Later, Henry takes Zoey to a Starbucks where he reveals he's not actually a barista. He's the owner of the coffee shop. Not only that, but he owns the building the coffee shop is in, and a few other buildings down the street in downtown Manhattan. So like multi-million-dollar buildings. And the key to all of this, Henry tells Zoey, is the Latte Factor. Finally, we get to know the arcane secret of the Latte Factor, and it's exactly what you think. Stop buying lattes and put that money into investments instead. That's the Latte Factor. And here's the thing. In this story, Henry is 70, and he owns multiple buildings in New York City. I feel dumb saying this because this is a fictional man who does not actually exist, but there is no way that Henry was able to afford everything he has with the Latte Factor, or even with like the profits of a coffee shop. There had to be so many more factors that got Henry to that level of financial success. And I don't know that that's really the point, that like everyone who does the Latte Factor will be able to like afford huge amounts of real estate or whatever. I think obviously that's not the idea. But then like, why have that be what Henry does? Here's the real twist in this section. The third secret is not the Latte Factor. The third secret is to live rich now. Out of all of the secrets that Henry tells, this is the one that I really resonate with the most. Henry tells Zoey it's time to talk about what's important. And when Zoey asks him, okay, what's important? He says, no, you need to tell me. Because all of what we're doing with your money ultimately comes back to what is important to you. And Zoey reflects on how she really wants to become a photographer, and she wants to travel more, and she wants to live in her own place and not have roommates and all this stuff. Henry tells Zoey to make a savings account for taking a photography class and having an auto deposit of money into that with every paycheck so she can eventually afford it. Because your money isn't just something to use in your retirement, it's something that should make your life richer now. You can live a rich life now. And the book ends with a flash forward 3 years later to Zoey traveling. She kept the job at the magazine she liked instead of taking the higher stress one with the emoticon girl. With the 3 secrets and the Latte Factor, she's living a rich life now, and she's setting herself up for a rich life in retirement. And I love that. That's honestly great. But here's my problem. Just like David Bach's stock market projections, this approach only accounts for the positive things in your life and none of the other stuff. There are things I need to pay for, things I need to save for, that aren't things that like make my heart leap. They're just like things I need, like insurance or a working car. And there is absolutely no discussion about how Zoey affords the rest of her life apart from her savings goals. If the only thing I'm really tracking is my photography class savings and then I have a big expensive car repair, where is that money coming from? How many people wind up pulling it from the photography class, or wind up putting it on a credit card, or just pay it, but then they feel kind of antsy because they don't know if they can actually afford it? If you just follow the advice in this book, I don't know that you're actually going to feel more financially secure. You might have more money in investments, or you might not, because you have to halt investments in order to pay for all the other stuff that happens in your life. And because at no point are you sitting down and just looking at like, what does it cost to be me? And how does that square with my paycheck? There's no point at which you'd be able to go, okay, like I can afford my life, this is fine. It's just a total blind spot. It is somehow pulling in the killjoy thing of like,
Hey, don't buy your lattes. You're latteing your life away.
And then also being like hyper aspirational and being like,
But you can live rich now.
and it's not really dealing with any of the other realities of managing money. The tone of this book, the way every like twist is kind of painfully obvious and predictable, it kind of babies you. It kind of assumes that you don't have what it takes to be able to actually manage your own money. And I just don't think that's true. I think that if you took the time to reflect on your priorities, to look at your dollars and decide what you want each of those dollars to do, that you'll find that your money reflects your priorities much better. We've seen at YNAB over and over and over that the thing that brings people actual resilience is not just like automating everything so that you never think about money. It's actually taking time to look at all the dollars you have and deciding what you want those dollars to do, actually giving them specific jobs. And when something changes that you didn't anticipate, that you have the wisdom to be able to go, okay, I did set aside money for this, but I think this is more important, so I'm going to pull money from that for now. Maybe I will put off the photography class for a while. Or maybe I won't. Maybe I'll pull that from somewhere else. I think that you have the capability to do that. And David Bach doesn't. So what does David Bach do? He says, well, aren't we all just a little bougier than we ought to be? Just be a bit less bougie and you'll be rich. No, you won't. This idea that the way to become rich is just to like back off on the lattes, this just isn't what the data shows. These aren't the core problems that people are facing. From 2014 to 2024, inflation was about 31% cumulatively. According to Finance Buzz, a Starbucks Grande Cafe Latte went from $3.65 to $4.45, a 22% increase, below standard inflation. Meanwhile, rent went up 52%, childcare went up 53%, and housing prices have gone up 45% in the last 5 years. Bach says it's all about these little things, these tiny adjustments. And is there wiggle room there? Absolutely. So many YNABers have seen incredible results in just being more intentional about their spending. And a lot of times that does mean cutting this or adjusting that, but our most impactful decisions are around the big things. What kind of car we drive, how many cars we drive, where we live, how we take care of kids. And funny enough, when you make changes to those things, that becomes far more automatic. A couple years ago, I calculated that my last job's commute cost me over $5,000 a year. And now that I work from home, that's way less. I don't really need a lot of extra willpower to not commute to my old job. That would be weird. But here's the thing, those kinds of big decisions, those aren't just about your bank balance. You're looking at how you want to establish your community, how you want to take care of your kids, or if you even want to have kids, whether you prefer the convenience of 2 cars or just having one. Those are big decisions that require a lot of thought and consideration and reflections on like, what does a good life look like for you and what does it look like to get there? The whole appeal of the Latte Factor is make this teeny tiny sacrifice and then automate everything, and all of a sudden you'll see these huge dividends. And then, surprise, surprise, those dividends don't wind up being nearly as big as David Bach makes it sound. It's handing you a silver bullet when what you need is to establish a mindset and a practice for looking at your life realistically and intentionally and making sure your dollars are doing what you actually want them to do. Here at YNAB, we've seen thousands of people experience profound transformation by just asking themselves a few questions and developing a habit of giving every dollar a job. If you want a grounded, sustainable practice for spending your dollars with more intentionality so you can live the life you want and stop second guessing yourself all the time, you can check out this video right here. And you can subscribe here. That is what we are talking about all the time. Bye.